Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have a great one in store for you today that plans to cover how to break through the B2B noise out there. There's a lot of content, a lot of noise out there, so always trying to figure out the best way to get in front of your audience at the right place at the right time. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, so let's just hop right into it. For a few housekeeping slides here at the beginning, you can chat with us on social media. Please feel free to tell us what you're thinking about when it comes to, breaking through the noise, breaking through the clutter, asking questions along the way. You'll see all of today's speakers' handles here on this slide, and be sure to use the hashtag CO series so we can keep in the loop of what everybody's chatting about. As some of you may be already aware, if you've attended previous sessions, or whether that be today or yesterday, we're giving away a lot of great prizes this week throughout the campaign optimization series. You can get anything from $5 Starbucks gift cards to free tickets to our annual B2BMX show, or even a pair of Apple AirPods. I could really use a new pair, but I'm not going to be able to get those, sadly, but I'm sure somebody out there will get them. So be sure to sign up and register for all of the sessions this week. And if you're attending live, you get a better chance to win. So keep on checking out the content throughout this whole entire week. If you haven't noticed already, we're coming to you through the On24 platform. So when it comes to the platform, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A widget that should be at the top right corner of your screen. You can also follow along with all of the social chatter that's going on in the widget that's on the left side of your screen. There is also going to be a survey that'll pop up at the end of the webcast that we're looking to gain and collect feedback from our audience. So any and all feedback, it would be greatly appreciated. It helps us produce better content for you in the future. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Or if you'd want to get it done and dusted real quick, you can click on that little button circled there at the bottom of your screen to pull the survey up right away. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's presentation. We have Tessa and Matt Heinz. Tessa is the Senior Director of Branded Communications at On24. She is a content prodigy, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of stuff discussed today, and it's going to be a great conversation, and it will be nothing but excellent. And this other person doesn't really need an introduction. He is a leader in the space, industry thought leader, producing great research and providing a lot of great insights at Heinz Marketing, Mr. Matt Heinz. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Matt right now. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. I realize, looking at our headshots there on that last slide, we both have a little more facial hair now than we maybe used to. So I'm not sure how old yours is. I'm not going to give away how old my headshot is. We're approaching realtor land, I think, a little bit with mine. But anyway, now we're here to talk about. I want to thank Dimension for what. Yeah, Tessa, go ahead.
I was going to say, I thought you were talking about me with the facial hair, and I was going to be offended, but I'm glad that you clarified. So
no, I left you out of this particular part of the conversation. You. Yeah, no, you look fantastic as always in your photo as well as live. All right, we're devolving already, folks. But for those of you still with us, I want to cover some research we did earlier this spring around content marketing effectiveness, and we released this for the first time at On24's Webinar World Conference in San Francisco in March. And I want to highlight a little of what we saw in this research. And unfortunately, you see number one here in terms of the takeaways from the research is that we are getting worse at content, not better. This isn't a bad thing. You look at a lot of organizations, a lot of trends, we tend to get at some point to this trough of disillusionment where we think we're doing things well, and then we look at what we're doing and compare that to what really matters, and we're like, we've got more work to do. That's where we are. And if that's where we are, that means we're on the precipice of doing some pretty amazing things as content marketers. But I do think that some of the stats, because we asked some questions that we had asked about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and we definitely saw a downward trend in some of the efficacy and satisfaction levels. So we'll talk about that. But once we get that bad news out of the way, I want to talk about the good news. There was a minority of people in the survey that were very clearly seeing results, positive results, success from their content, success tied to engagement in their content. Now, I want to highlight a little some of what they saw most successfully that they were working on. So some highlights from the research that we did, we found that less than 10% of respondents reported that the organization's content marketing was effective. That was down from what we saw before. I'll walk through that in a minute. 20% of respondents said that they were extremely or very confident in their content creating meaningful messages and relevant content for their target audience. I thought this was really interesting as we've seen a diversification of content tied to different personas and different members of the buying committee. It's no longer good enough just to have a piece of content for a stage of the buying journey. So we've seen a little bit of downward trend there. We saw less than 10% of people reporting that they were extremely very confident in their ability to measure the impact of their content. And I think here, again, I think there's some interesting trends in terms of what people are measuring and confidence in the type of metrics marketers are seeing that we'll walk into in here in a second. We saw a very small percent of people saying they were extremely confident that their content was driving desired results. And I think some of that is tied to what people define as desired results, what content marketers define as their results, what their peers define, what their managers, what their board defines as results. That has contributed from what we've seen to this trough of disillusionment in the content marketing side. And then finally, less than 20% of our respondents reported being effective or having a single integrated content strategy and execution. Lots of companies, lots of content marketers, lots of organizations have siloed content development efforts where there isn't a level of integration across channels, across messages to create velocity, momentum with the prospects and with the buyers. We certainly saw that as well. So, all right, we're going to mire ourselves in some of the bad news here for a little bit. Just stick with me, but I think it's important to point out why we're seeing some of these results before we get into the good results. So if you'll see, the green represents what was working, particularly what the answers that we had from a couple years ago, and the blue represents what we're seeing today. And you certainly see that we're, especially around content strategy effectiveness, where we said somewhat effective, 18%, almost half of people are saying they're somewhat effective today. Look at the varied extremely effective numbers in here as well. You see that 30% of people thought their content marketing was effective. We're less than 10% now. So we're seeing that dip in content strategy effectiveness. And when we ask people similar questions around whether their content is delivering relevancy to a target audience, we saw a similar decline. I mean, look at that somewhat confident number where we previously saw much higher numbers at the higher end of the scale. Almost 40% of marketers are now really not sure whether their content is performing at the level they think they should be. And some of this is tied to the type of content we're creating. Like, what's the nature of that content? What are the attributes of that content? And so when we ask people to answer questions around, is their content engaging? Is their content driving action? And should it be? So there's a difference between the importance score and the performance score. We ask people to say, how important is it for you to have content that's engaging and drives action? But then how effective are you at doing it? We saw some pretty significant gaps. We usually see this in categories where we're asking people to step up and doing something more than just produce. We're asking that production of content to be more effective. When we ask people the segments of content they're creating around, instead of just creating good content about their company, just creating good content for engagement, not surprising to see a high percent of people creating content around target personas. We've seen that number reasonably high for the last several years. But when we then ask people to create content tied to stages of the buying journey, when we ask people to say, is your content tied to beginning of funnel, middle of funnel, late funnel, we're down close to 15%. So the majority of people are creating content for those sales stages, but just barely the majority of people doing that. And then when we look at the kind of content being created for sales, this is where I start to get a little weepy, quite honestly, Tessa, because if you look at the kind of content that we're creating for sales, it tends to be very much about the bottom of the funnel. It's the kind of product marketing content we've seen for years around case study and product service collateral, which is great. in its place. But what happens is if this is the majority of what we're providing for sales, then the sales is providing this content at every stage of the buying journey. And what we've learned over the last 4 to 6 years is to get your prospects' attention, to get engagement, to break through the noise and clutter of all the other content out there, you have to deliver new ideas. You have to bring new insights and reframes of problems that your customers have. And that's where the commercial insights and primary research comes in. And unfortunately, still today, we see that as the minority of content. Less than 10% of the people we polled are creating content with new insights and new research, bringing new ideas to the table to engage their prospects. This is a problem, but it's also, I think, a big opportunity. Now let's talk about measuring content's impact. And this is where I think you get various answers from people. When we ask people their ability to measure content's impact, the number's gone down significantly. Look in particular at that somewhat effective content difference, almost 50% now, versus a much smaller number before. But when we ask people, like, what are you measuring? What is content marketing's impact? You go a little deeper and it becomes clear that there's a variety of answers to that question. And I think this is where this maybe trough of disillusionment is partially tied to as well. Tessa, I think, when you're looking at people that are measuring, is our content effective? Some people may say yes, but they're doing that because they're measuring clicks, they're measuring audience, they're measuring, views, they're measuring the marketing of more, where we know that impressions aren't necessarily tied to the revenue marketing metrics that matter.
Yeah, there's a lot of KPIs that are tied to internal politics versus the external results, and even worse, the experience you're creating for your audience. I think that a lot of that results in us being marketing for ourselves versus for our audience, because we're just thinking about the end result versus like what are the little iterative wins we can make with our content as we go and we engage with someone, as they start to learn more about our company and the problem we'll solve for them. And something that we've started doing is looking at content not just from a lens of what's the end result, but how are we using content to learn more about the person we're engaging to then optimize the next step and personalize that next step as they move through their journey, whether that's a linear one or a circular one. I think that looking at content as a way to get insights is a metric that matters and definitely should start to be something content marketers think about.
Well, I mean, you're right on point. And I think that, again, part of that, decrease in confidence is tied to people being comfortable with measuring what they control, which is clicks and likes and volume, but being uncomfortable measuring the revenue impact of that content. We don't have direct lines in many cases with good content. You create good content that isn't necessarily a new lead gen campaign. And so knowing whether that actually generated a lead conversion or sales opportunity is a difficult number to measure. So good to see that people, when we ask them what are the most important metrics, not necessarily what they're measuring today, but most important metrics, we saw pipeline related numbers. I know we talked about this last month, Tessa. I want to talk to the 2% that say their most important content metric is likes. Like, that is just phenomenal. There's got to be, to have a bell curve, you have to have both ends of the bell curve, right? So God bless the 2%. All right. Confidence that content is driving results. And this is a question that we did not ask 2 years ago, but we wanted to ask it now to sort of establish a benchmark. And, somewhat confident, I think, was the kind of an answer here, right? And the half of the people are like, I think I'm generating good content, but I don't necessarily have the ability to measure that. And this is another gap, Tessa, that we see when you've got content done in silos, when you've got content and engagement that doesn't tie back into your CRM, that doesn't inform the rest of the organization on what they should do. You can feel like you've got good results and good impact on content, but if you can't see it in the numbers, it's hard to go and justify doing more of that content.
I mean, there's no perfect science. That's the problem, but that's also the beauty with content, is that if it was just as easy as pushing something out, then someone like me wouldn't have a job, right? Like, there's an art to it. And it has to be a summation of all the parts rather than just the one silver bullet.
All right, so we spent a little time talking about the bad news. I was told long ago you give bad news first and then you give good news. So we've wallowed a bit into the trough of disillusionment. So let's climb the peak of success and impact that some of the people in this survey have already seen, right? And so when we go in and we ask people, are they seeing an impact? Like I said earlier, there's two ends of the bell curve. So let's look at the people on the other side of the mountain. Let's look at the things that they're doing successfully. And when we asked them, when we dug in and looked at their campaigns, engagement was a key theme. We saw engagement over and over and over again. We saw some programs on the most successful side of the maturity peak where the content wasn't complete until the prospect engaged with the content. Like, think about what that might mean for your content, where they're not just reading and consuming content, but they're part of that content to make it more engaging and to make it more personalized. So personalization was an enormous part. I know we'll talk a little more about this, and I think, Tessa, you've got some great examples where the rubber meets the road to make content personalized. I think doing that at scale is a huge challenge for marketers, but we have access now to tools and strategies that are making that easier. I talked a little bit about the interactivity of content and getting people engaged. If we want to keep the attention and to play into this lower attention span of some of our prospects, we have to have content that actually drives engagement and curiosity. How are you encouraging people to learn something new? In some cases, to tease ideas and to tease what's coming next, to really spike that curiosity and get them interested. And the other piece, you look at what's working for the most successful marketers today versus those that aren't being as successful, especially in B2B, it's really easy to write static, boring B2B content that appears as if it's written for buildings. Some of the best content plays into the humanity of us all. It plays into the fact that we have interests outside of just work. It plays into the fact that we have senses of humor, believe it or not. You can have some humor as part of your B2B content and actually drive more interactivity, drive more curiosity. We saw earlier as well the fact that there aren't as many marketers creating content for specific buying stages, for specific instances. The precision of content being created by marketers for different points in time for the right members of the buying committee at the right stage of the buying journey is critical for those most successful marketers amongst us. And last but not least, I would actually say is brevity. Sometimes when we think of creating more content, we think, well, I got to have another 20-page white paper, or I need an email that describes everything about my business. The less you say sometimes, the more you get across. Mark Twain was famous for saying, if I would have had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. Every time you write and create a piece of content is an opportunity to go back and take out words, take out content to make it more meaningful, more impactful, and more precise and more in a shorter period of time. Briefly, before I let Tessa take over here, and again, if you like what you're seeing here, there's a broader paper that we put together that has a lot of the content from the research report and some of the implications from it. But I think there were some specific things that we saw those most successful people do that we put into sort of an engagement success framework. Some of those criteria and things you have to do up front. Number one is planning. I think there's a lot of random acts of marketing that just people go right from step zero into blog posts or into webinars. But I think thinking strategically about what you're trying to get done and operationally about how that's going to exist in your content. We could spend a whole other 45 minutes just talking about that piece. I think there is no default format for content as well, whether you're doing a written piece of content or video only, or in this case, we've got video and a little interactivity along with some slides in detail. I think thinking about your audience and what they're going to need and what they care about and being very precise and intentional about choosing that format is really, really important. And you've heard me weave throughout this conversation so far today the importance of measurement. Look, I don't mean to poo-poo the idea of tracking clicks and likes. I mean, those become evidence of engagement. It becomes evidence of a prospect where you have some of their attention. But you want to separate your operational scorecard from your impact scorecard, right? There's a difference between the effectiveness of the marketing itself and the effectiveness of marketing as a function of driving revenue results. And it's really important to consider those two separately and to drive different sets of tactics around them. A couple of things I want to remind people around personalization, because this is a huge part of content, a huge part of marketing today. I did a webinar earlier today with a video platform player, and we were talking a lot about the importance of personalization and how do you do that at scale. And I think a lot of people, especially when you start thinking about video, you start thinking, oh my gosh, do I have the right stuff around me? Is the lights on right? Well, I mean, Tessa, you and I are doing this and not in studios, right? I am in my office where someone would probably tell me I'm in front of a window. There's a lot of natural light coming in. It's probably making my head shine more than usual. But you know what? Perfect's the enemy of good. And so if you worry too much about making it perfect, you won't get something good into the market. And I honestly think, and I've seen evidence of this in some of the research we've done, that when you have content that is imperfect, when you have a video that shows you in all your imperfect glory, people spend more time thinking about it. If you look too polished, like I've done and seen videos from big companies where you've got lots of makeup and you're reading from scripts, and it's not interesting, it's not engaging, it doesn't keep people's attention. A little bit goes a long way in that personalization. It doesn't have to all be personalized, but even sometimes thinking not just content for the audience of one, but content of the audience of few. What can you do to create audience for content personalized to segments of people so that the right person at the right time sees some of that content in the right place at the right time? So building that content in the cohorts and not just individuals becomes important. And finally, don't just limit yourself to video to business context. I think some of the best, especially best webinar and video formats I see, people have fun. People are self-deprecating. People bring props. I think the biggest challenge we have today as marketers and salespeople is getting and earning someone's attention. And when you can do that by having some fun, for bringing other things into the conversation, I really think that you win. Last but not least, before we have Tessa take over, is the idea of getting sales to use your content. I will summarize these in one message, which is your sales team is making daily decisions about what's going to help them make the most money. If they're not using your content today, it means they don't think your content can make them as much money as something else they could be doing with their time or sharing with their prospects. One of you is wrong. Either your sales rep is wrong and doesn't understand how impactful that content is, and that's on you to communicate that, or you are wrong because you're giving the sales team content or giving that sales rep content that actually isn't useful for that moment of time, isn't useful in helping them get engagement and attention from that prospect. So being more precise, being more accurate, being more intentional about creating the right content at the right point in time to help make your sales team more effective and more efficient is the name of the game. Again, we could spend a whole other 45 minutes talking about this topic alone, but think like a salesperson. Is this content going to help them move the ball forward, increase velocity and interest and conversion from the prospects they care about? So a lot of theory, a lot of research, a lot of implications here, and I know we want to get into some of the specifics of how companies are actually implementing this now. And to do that, Tessa Barron.
Hi. Oh, thanks, Matt. And it was a great way of teeing me up because I'm going to take a step back and explain to you all out there how we evaluate whether we do content or not. And it is exactly the lens that Matt just suggested. Is it getting results? So we took a step back, analyzed all of our content, tactics, channels last year. And yes, I'm biased, but it turned out that for On24, webinars rose to the top in terms of the content that influenced the greatest amount of opportunities. So 66% of our bookings last year were influenced by webinars and any other content experiences we create at the same time, and this is where it's important. And so it's not just that webinars are great for us as marketers. We're being told by Serious Decisions and other analysts, and I think even Demand Gen report themselves, that buyers actually prefer it. And I think it's for the reason Matt just described. There's a human aspect to it, and if you can't meet in person anymore, webinars become the next best thing. So I'm going to share with you how we at On24 leverage webinars across the customer journey. And it really starts with a framework. And that is all about the stage. And so like Matt mentioned, only about 50% of marketers are creating content for their sales stage for that process. And we are one of those 50%. So we see the customer journey not being linear, but at some point throughout their learning process, throughout their engagement with us, there is an acquisition phase, a point of conversion, a point of nurture and or acceleration. Those two things could both happen. They aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You might not necessarily need to nurture a lead. And then there's a close to customer cycle. So for us, what that looks like at On24 is we line up content for every piece of that. So at the acquisition phase, we typically, we will do a thought leadership webinar because that's what's going to get the broad reach, bring in a third-party influencer. And this is where the data acquisition comes into play. In that acquisition stage, the most important thing for us is to understand what is that person interested in so that then we can optimize the second touch for conversion. For us, that's a customer webinar. There is a testimonial, just will always, I believe, is tried and true, the best point of conversion. We like to serve it up in a webinar because there is that interactive element. And what we do is in that acquisition phase, get an interest, whether it's a use case, a topic, a vertical, to then send out the customer webinar to align with that interest. Within that conversion point is where it's really critical to understand velocity. Is this person ready to go into an active sales cycle, or do they need time? Do they need more education? So sometimes you're gonna hear like someone's not gonna be that engaged, and that's when they're gonna need to be nurtured, and that's in a more of a self-discovery, more education. And within that, you're looking to see when are they ready to be accelerated. And then in the acceleration phase, that's really how can I get this person into a conversation with sales? And for us, that's a product demo in combination with a personalized ABM tactic, personalized content. So we really only invest in that personalized content experience when someone's in that very close to being ready for that sales conversation. And then all the way through to close, thinking about how do you get someone from signing that contract into an immediate adoption phase so that they're primed for customer success. And then along the way, this is what I love to call a trigger. So whether someone's in acquisition, conversion, nurture, acceleration, you might not know what other content they're consuming. They may have educated themselves. And what you need to do is prime your content to have triggers that will sense signals and be ready to push someone past the typical next step if they're ready to talk to sales. You don't want to waste time nurturing a lead if indeed they've already evaluated other competitors, but you might not know that. So within a thought leadership webinar, have triggers, and for us with webinars, that's polls and surveys to be able to suss out if someone is actually really more in an acceleration phase. So I don't know, Matt, it was a lot of, that's a methodology. I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Well, this is my favorite slide of this whole presentation because I think this kind of encapsulates everything we've talked about so far. It's pretty. It's got all the colors of PowerPoint, and then also like if you were to kind of take out the content piece in the middle maybe, but then keep in the lead stage, the insights, and the triggers. I mean, this is a format and this is a structure that any company can use. And so if you aren't thinking about your content in this kind of a structure, if you aren't thinking about a level of precision for the type of content, the format of that content, and then what its job is in terms of creating either interest or velocity or readiness, I think this is a place to start. And so I would highly encourage, this is hopefully if we were doing this live, this is where all the iPhones would come up, people taking pictures of this to go back and print out and take to their team and say like, how do we customize this for our business? So if you do nothing else from this webinar, customize this for your business. This is great.
Well, they can screenshot it. Screenshot is the virtual iPhone shot. So I'm gonna explain how then we take this framework and actually what the webinars are that we create at each of those touch points within the customer journey, and then how we get those insights that I talked about. So in the acquisition stage, this is a look at one of our top of funnel webinars. It's a panel thought leadership conversation that's all themed to a topic. We're about to get super meta because this is a panel of customers, influencers. It has not a lot to do with On24. And what we're talking about is topical marketing. So it's the topic is topical marketing, but the whole point is it's really trend based. I know it is. We're super meta right now, Matt. It's trend based and it's not about our product at all. But what it's teeing up is a conversation starter. So like Matt said, there's not content being created on the research side, not on the trend side. And that's largely because salespeople really don't know how to start. I think it's really hard. So when you have these top of funnel experiences where you're saying, you're first of all, priming that to get an interest. Obviously that person is interested in topical marketing. And then within that, you ask a poll question. So you'll see that to say, are you doing topical marketing? Why or why not? Now sales has a starting point for their conversation. Beyond that, you'll see in this, the lead form in acquisition, we're actually asking right off the bat, what's your vertical? And that is all about then making sure that we are priming the pump for conversion in the next phase. And then within it though, we always have a trigger. And for us, it's our daily demo, which happens to be also served up in a webinar. But that way, if someone comes to this typical top of funnel thought leadership webinar and doesn't need to be nurtured, they're ready to talk to sales, they're ready for that bottom of funnel content, we're able to surface that and act on it immediately. So now thinking about conversion. So for us, we treat the conversion stage, it is the same play every time, an on-demand customer webinar. And that's because the on-demand is great because it means it's always ready. We don't have to wait for the next calendar item to come up. So our conversion stage is all about having the voice of the customer shine through and having it be in the same industry as the prospect we're trying to engage. So someone said they're in financial services, they came to that first topical marketing webinar. The next touch that we want to serve them is an on-demand financial services customer story. You'll see this is one of our customers, Financial Engines. And what that's allowing us to do is give a third-party validation that they should even be talking to us. And then ideally seeing how ready are they? How fast are they going to move? And that's where we have a poll to determine that velocity. When do you want a new webinar solution? And then a trigger for learning more. And then also within that form fill, we're looking in this, the gate for the webinar itself. We ask, how active are you with using webinars? That's what we're selling. So that's what we're asking. And that's going to help us understand, are we going to need to educate them more? Or is this person already an expert and we just need to convince them that they should be using our product versus another? So that's that conversion phase. And this is a look at what that trigger, what that does operationally on the back end. So let's say that poll question says, I'm ready, I'm eager, then that goes right directly to our salesperson and they can act on it immediately. And we set that up all on the back end because the On24 platform integrates with marketing automation platforms and CRM systems. So that all happens without us having to touch it, which is, I think that's the magic, right? The sooner you can get a lead in your sales fingertips, the better, especially if they're ready. So then when it comes, so let's say though that person's not ready and they need to be nurtured more, we'll serve up an engagement hub. That's what we call it here at On24. But really what that is it's setting up someone's own little Netflix portal to binge on content primed for the based upon the interest they judge. Here, this is our FinServe prospect. We found out they're in financial services. There's a lot of companies that could be classified in multiple verticals. So it's actually really important to have someone self-select. And then we found out, what they're most interested in a certain pain point, and we prime that content accordingly. And when we see consumption and engagement rising, then we're going to assume they're ready. That is our trigger to understand if they're really engaged or if they're just, they're still needing to be nurtured more. So once we see, 3 or 4 of this pieces of this content activated, that's when it's ready for acceleration. And that's what this looks like on the back end. So engagement is high because they've spent a lot of time. And now, again, we know it's a very, very specific interest. And we move to acceleration. And that's where that word, I think our favorite word, personalization, comes into play. So, I think it's important that you don't spend time personalizing content for leads that aren't going to convert. If they're not ready, they're telling you that. So stop trying to think that putting their logo on a piece of content is what's going to get them to want to take a sales meeting. It just doesn't work like that. So personalization for us happens when we're ready, when it feels like they're ready for to move fast. And we have what we call a daily demo. This is actually personalized for an asset management customer. So that's something that's always on. And once we've seen that engagement score go up, they're highly engaged, then we automatically, that triggers this on-demand demo. They go in there. If someone's in a demo, that's also a really powerful signal that they are evaluating platforms. It's also a signal that they're likely having conversations internally with others. So that's where the buying committee comes in. And what we follow up after a demo with is, okay, so now we know who you are. We're going to invest. You went to a demo. This is worth the investment in a personalized content experience. And we'll quickly create what we call a target page using our product. But what that's doing is it's tailoring the experience for that account so that now that they've evaluated the platform and what happens next, they're going into their boss's office, we're arming them with that content. And then as we see other people within that account start engaging with that content, we know those stakeholders are starting to weigh in. And that's really powerful for salespeople to understand. I know, Matt, you've done a lot on ABM and the rise of buying committees. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this paradigm.
Well, I think it's important. I liked your message earlier about some prospects just aren't ready to buy, so don't ask them to buy. Don't overinvest in that audience. One of my favorite sort of pro tips as a tactic with webinars is if you do a good webinar somewhere in the middle or even the top of the funnel, at the end of the funnel you can say, hey, you know what, this webinar is sponsored by On24, and On24 provides a fantastic engagement channel for you to create a multimedia experience for your prospects in a variety of webinar contexts. If that's something you'd like to learn more about, just click yes on this polling question and we'll get back to you. And so you literally put up a polling question and a percent of people answer it, and a percent of people answer yes, and those become the hot webinar leads. And for salespeople, that's crack, And so I think it's part of the experience for the people that want to learn more to be invited to learn more, to get that feedback. And for others that simply want more content, that want more engagement, you give them that experience as well. So I think that level of personalized experience at a strategic and tactical level, it respects the prospect and where they are. And when you respect the prospect at their stage of the buying journey, you earn more attention and engagement from them in the process.
Yeah, I think also, Brian, I know you were talking about a creep factor when it comes to personalization, but if someone's opted into a demo, it's no longer creepy to send them a personalized page, because that's a pretty strong signal. Like that goes from creepy to helpful, because there's, they came to a demo, they're obviously evaluating you. They're not just unless they really have nothing to do, they're probably not just wasting their time going to a product demo. Now you've done some of that work for them by creating a tailored, personalized page that they can use for that internal selling, internal conversation around, budget and buy-in. So that's really where our personalization and having a much more thoughtful way of saying, hey, to this account, this is why you should buy it. Yes, that's where it's in, and that's really where it matters. We're also looking for questions. So if there's a stakeholder who comes on and they're the doubtful one, they might be that person who stands between us and getting the deal across the finish line. There's a CTA to ask a question, and that's going to help us understand where there might be roadblocks, and again, give that to sales to quickly mitigate. So now if everything went perfectly, we're now in close. And I think, that means that our salesperson got some of those stakeholder questions answered. We were able to get that deal across the finish line. We don't stop. And that's really, from close to customer and beyond, you have to keep engaging, because especially if you're selling a SaaS platform, selling is one thing, adopting it is entirely another. Having success with it, that's yet another challenge. And I think that we as marketers can't just think that, once it gets past to sales, we're done. No, you need to provide a holistic experience. And for us, we immediately kick in with an on-demand webinar, welcoming a customer to our platform, getting them on board, setting them up for adoption. I think sometimes the first 60 days are critical as to whether or not a customer is going to want to continue to work with us annually, whether or not they're going to renew, and even more so if they're going to be a potential target for upsell. So we want to prime that pump right out of the gate, because it really helps us set the stage for their entire success with our platform. So that's just a view into how we're optimizing content experiences across our customers' journey. Matt, I'll kick it back to you to kind of sum up and maybe put my example into the context of what people should really do.
Yeah, love it. Thank you, Tessa. You are very good at this. Tessa's part of the presentation today, by the way, sponsored by Red Bull. So thank you, Tessa, very much for all of that. Quickly, in summary, before we get to our Q&A, you've heard some of these themes throughout the presentation today. But number one, prioritize engagement. That may sound like sort of a general topic, but think about some of the content you've seen in the past that has been very one-sided. Figure out a way to get people more engaged as part of your content. Make them part of the experience. I think it's important, as we've talked about, to really make sure personalization is a key part of what you're doing with your content. Personalize in the right place at the right stage of the buying journey, as Tessa so smartly pointed out, but make sure personalization is a part of what you're doing. Focus on the prospect's part of the story versus your own. There's a time and a place to ask for the demo and to start talking about your own products and services, but the majority of the funnel, especially at the top and the middle, is about the prospect story and getting them engaged and interested based on what they're doing. And last but not least, all of what we're doing today is not tied to siloed channels. It's not just your marketing channel. It's not just your webinar channel. The more you align and integrate everything you're doing in front of your customer across marketing and sales, the better off you're going to be. So those were our key summary points. We've covered a ton, Tessa, in the last 40 minutes, but I think some good stuff to give people some food for thought. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Demand Gen Report, for the opportunity. And Brian, we'll pass it back to you. I'm sure we've got some questions.
Yeah, definitely. We got a lot of questions coming through, and I appreciate the awesome presentation from the both of you. It was a lot of great insights shared there. But before we get into the questions, I want to make sure that everyone takes the time to take that little survey at the end of this webcast, because without that type of insight and information, we can't produce the high quality content that you rightfully deserve. So please fill that out and tell us how you think about it, and we'll be keeping an eye out for that. So Tessa, Matt, let's jump right into the questions here. The first question I have here is from Tanya, and Tessa, you hinted that we had this kind of a conversation prior to the webcast about obsessing over personalization and how it could lead to a little too much obsession, and it could come off a little bit creepy. So Tanya asked, personalization can give off a creep factor sometimes. So how do you find that healthy balance between, not creeping your prospective customers out and providing a personalized, relevant, contextual customer experience?
I mean, for us, it's all about timing, right? I think that's clear. It's balancing the resources it'll take to actually create that personalized experience with the outcome. And someone who's just getting to know you, shouting at them like you would a friend, is probably just not the right play. But someone who has, you've they've had a few touches, they've consumed quite a bit of content. Now it changes the relationship from you being a creep to yeah, you're a friendly face. You can come at them at a personal level. So I really think it's the timing of it, and not thinking you have to have a completely tailored experience. It's more about focusing on where it matters. Matt?
Yeah, definitely agree there. Matt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, look, whatever you're about to put in front of your prospect, think to yourself, would this make me feel creepy? Would this make me feel pushy? I mean, think about the best sales experiences you've had as an individual, whether as a consumer or as a business buyer. It's a business that has respected your time and respected the stage of the buying journey you're at. That has not pushed you faster than you're ready to go. No matter how good your sales and marketing is, you will not control when the prospect is ready to buy. But when they're ready to buy, you have to understand and know that and react accordingly. So, yeah, there's a creep factor when you're trying to push people into a timeline that is yours and not theirs, and you have to be aware of that.
Fully agree there. Next question we have is from Emily. Emily asks, how should people approach the strategic planning part of ensuring engagement success? We kind of touched on it. I think it was one of the earlier slides on ensuring engagement success, but making sure that you're doing the right planning, you're doing the nitty gritty, dirty work to understand the tactics, understanding what data is important to you, understanding what needs to happen in order to offer this type of seamless experience. Matt, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to address that one. And Emily, thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, if you start out by treating this as a webinar planning exercise, you've already failed. I think if you start by thinking about the experience you want to create for your customer and the outcome you want to create for her, not for you, but for her, that's where you start, right? And you understand the revenue outcome you want to get to, but you understand the customer outcome that's going to get that individual, that prospect, to want to spend more time with you, to engage more with you, to want to explore more deeper into the buying process. That's where you win. Now, fortunately, the format of webinars provides a really rich, comprehensive way of addressing people in a variety of different formats, as Tessa pointed out, and in various different tactical examples across the buying journey. But this isn't about the webinar, it's about the customer experience. And I think that's where you can apply a level of strategy and strategic thinking and planning to create an environment, to create an experience that is more personalized, that is more customized, and more impactful for your audience.
Yeah, I think it's about having that engagement, like natively getting the data you need from that person, having that being embedded natively into the experience versus it being like, here's the form and here's all the things I need to know about you to then send you a bunch of garbage follow-up later. Instead, it's more you're creating an experience that has naturally interactivity within it to then learn something about them, to then optimize that next step because it's better for them, not because you need to have, all these different inputs put into your database. And, I think it's very obvious people aren't stupid, and we are at a saturation point. So, you find people now more than ever wanting to stay anonymous. And why is that? It's because the experiences that they're getting and going to get are not great. So you have to figure out a way to make engagement truly a win-win, and one where your audience feels like they're gaining something, not giving you something.
Yeah, definitely agree there as well. The next question we have is coming from Mike, and it touches on the idea of scale. Obviously, a lot of the folks in attendance today are learning about, campaign optimization, and obviously from here, this point is around content optimization, ensuring that you're able to scale your content to meet your ever-growing needs and also meet your buyers' ever-growing needs. So Mike's asking, what tips and best practices would you share with folks to better position themselves to scale their content? Tess, you want to kick that one off first?
Yeah, I think there's a lot here to this. So I think the first thing I would say is try to stop treating your content as a destination and instead think about ways you can create little pieces of content that are iterative and end up building towards something bigger. So, a great example of this is for us, we don't start with an ebook and break it into pieces. We actually do blogs and then make it into an ebook. So that helps you not only reach scale, but iterate as you're doing so. I think the other aspect of it is that having and investing in content that is as dynamic and malleable as possible is where you'll win. So yes, for us, that is largely means we do a lot of webinars, and that's because we can take a single webinar, rebrand it, and optimize it for the person we're trying to reach with the interactivity around it without having to change the core content. And that for us is really powerful. I think it's sort of the decision of, are you going to try and personalize an entire website or just personalize the content it serves? That's a mindset. And I think for me, I'm really more about the not trying to make every single thing perfect, but instead just making the one thing that matters as best as possible for the person you're trying to reach.
Yeah, well said there. I definitely agree. Matt, what about you? What do you think?
One of the biggest sources of waste in marketing programs is when we create a piece of content, send it to everybody, and then move on to the next piece of content or the next campaign. If you look at, there's one of the analyst firms said that like 3 to 4% of any given market is actively buying. So if you put some content out in the market that is targeting active buyers, it only matters to 3 or 4% of people. So what if you could identify in your signals, in your content, in your engagement metrics, like which prospects are likely in that 3 to 4%, and send the content just to them? Because next week, next month, it's going to be a different group of people that are in that 3 to 4%. So my point is, like, when we create content and send it out, we're sending it out on our timeline most often, as opposed to the prospect's timeline. And if we can understand the prospect's timeline and put the right content in front of the right person, instead of sending out 100,000 emails today, maybe you send out 746. And next week it's 460. And the week after that it's 847. But it's tied specifically to the right place for the right person in the right time. And so you're leveraging that content you create over and over and over again to an audience that sees it as a new insight, as opposed to something that you think is 2 or 3 or 4 months old. And so I think aligning that perspective and that delivery timing around the customer can dramatically increase the efficiency of your content.
Mm-hmm. Definitely agree there. Very well said. And unfortunately, it looks like that's all the time we have for questions today. And also looking at this slide and looking at my headshot, I need to go talk to somebody about getting a new headshot. So I need to do that after this. So with that, thank you, Tessa. Thank you, Matt, for taking the time to join us today and share your thoughts and insights.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to join us for this webcast today. There was a lot of great insights, and if we did not get to your questions during that Q&A session, I promise you that we're going to be getting these questions mailed over to Tessa and Matt after this session, and they'll be in contact with you to get your questions answered. But one other thing I want to do before we sign off today is I want to make sure that everybody has these dates on their radar. We announced a new event that we are putting on in August, the B2B Sales and Marketing Exchange. It is going to be an awesome time in August, and it's going to be one that you don't want to miss. And then, as always, every February, we're putting on the annual B2B Marketing Exchange in Scottsdale, Arizona. So make sure that you keep these dates on your radar, and hopefully we get to see you there in person. And also continue to check out all the content that we're producing throughout this week. We have a lot of interesting topics, a lot of great speakers lined up throughout this week. Our next session is actually taking place at 3 o'clock, where we're going to be learning about how marketers can, practice a little more self-care and how they can, take a lot of the weight off of their shoulders and start learning how new emerging trends such as AI can help out with that. So that's coming up shortly. So other than that, thank you everybody for your time, and have a great rest of the day.